This video is brought to you by Skillshare. The first 1,000 people who click the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial. On January 11th, 2022, a woman posts a TikTok about dating. Within a week, the full name, workplace, and photos of a man have been leaked all over the internet. Large companies are condemning the man, ranging from sending tweets to taking out entire billboards mocking him and putting him on blast. His name and face draw tens of millions of video views and news site clicks. He is branded by The Tab as the most hated man on TikTok and by Vice as just some guy. What happened, and how do we make sure it never happens again? So, okay, what I want to talk to all of you about today isn't just this one guy. I'm not here to sit and recap a bunch of dating drama at you and ask you to make moral judgments on the people involved. What I do want to do is talk about a lot of things and how they come together online. Surveillance, public shaming, algorithms, our responsibilities to one another, and I want to use this insane story as a case study for what this all means for us going forward. But to do that, I need to give you some background first. It started with a TikTok. Back in the beginning of January, a creator with around 100,000 followers and a history of posting relatable content about dating in New York made this short video, essentially just making a joke about getting ghosted a lot with the caption mentioning a guy named Caleb. And very shortly thereafter, she started getting a bunch of comments from other women in New York, all wondering if they knew the guy she was making a vague post about. Lots of stuff like, wait, is this the Caleb who works at West Elm? That Caleb? And very, very quickly, a lot of people started to realize that all of these girls went on dates with the exact same guy.
I wasn't gonna make a video about this, but I feel like it's my duty as your Asian older sister to warn my New York City girls about this Caleb from West Elm ASAP. But I kept having girls comment being like, is this the West Elm Caleb? They've matched on Hinge before and that they were texting intensely for a while and he is like love bombing her even though they've never met up before, like have not gone on a first date. And I'm like, that is the biggest red flag out of all the red flags. Then of course he ghosts her. Maybe I am jumping to conclusions because I've only heard one story, but I just feel like love bombing is the gateway red flag to all of the other red flags. And if that many girls are commenting about you on a TikTok, that just like doesn't look good. And this is why we need that app I just talked about where we can leave reviews of guys we've dated on Hinge, because then I don't have to make this subtle video trying to warn this girl. I'm just gonna leave it up to the TikTok gods now, and if this video shows up on your For You page and you happen to be dating a West Elm Caleb, consider yourself warned.
Not only that, but there was a very specific pattern that all of these dates started to follow. He'd show a lot of interest at first, be very attentive, and go so far as to make a unique mixtape for each object of his affection. They'd spend a few weeks going on dates with the understanding that they were both having a lot of fun and wanted to continue the relationship, and then he'd vanish without a trace and move on to the next girl.
So this man was sending me really cute messages. He sent me this below. I have a really good feeling about you. I'm really excited. This was before our first date. So I was like, he likes me. Wrong. We go on our first date, we get dinner, we have dinner together, and then he's like, I want to see you again tomorrow. We're going to the Met. So we go to the Met. We're still texting every day, like he's blowing up my phone nonstop, telling me how much he likes me, how much he can't wait to see me, how he has really good feelings about me, can't imagine his life without me, like all these different things. And he discussed this, like I feel like on Hinge people just routinely talk to someone for a day and then meet someone else and pretend the previous didn't exist. And then he said, I'll ghost you soon, don't worry. I thought it was a joke. Apparently not a joke. So he randomly stopped texting me like out of the blue. And I was like, hey, what's up? And he was super short. Notice vibes were off.
I have never posted a TikTok, but I decided to make this to jump into the movement. When you ghost West Elm Caleb, but he still manages to ghost you.
And once everybody realized that this was the same guy going on all of these dates, all hell broke loose as the phenomenon blew up. A bunch of girls who went on dates with him started to share TikToks about their experiences with West Elm Caleb. People very quickly realized that he just passed the exact same playlist around to every single girl he dated and claimed he made it just for her, which to be fair is very funny. These women started making jokes about their experiences with him and sharing pictures of what he looked like. And very, very quickly, other people started to take notice as well. Right now, the West Elm Caleb TikTok hashtag has nearly 85 million views on it. That is 84.5 million views on the sum total of every piece of tagged content associated with this man. Other people latched onto this and loved it. It was the juiciest piece of drama in a while. Funny, dramatic, and low stakes enough that it was okay to laugh at. Very quickly, you'd see accounts tracking the guy down, posting his full name, trying to get him fired, and making humorous content about him. Whether it was jokes that the guy wasn't even hot, or jokes about going outside to find him or film him in real life, or jokes commenting on and recapping his Hinge bio, or just generally weighing in on everything, people couldn't get enough of it. And of course, neither could brands. You had streaming services like Peacock TV using the opportunity as a moment to market. An upcoming dating app took his bio and took out a giant fucking billboard calling his bio a red flag in order to promote their own app as presumably a Caleb-free place. Tabloid websites got in on it, everyone had their own joke or take to lend to the situation. All the while, you had responses ranging from mild amusement to finding and posting the full name of this man and his face across the internet for millions of people to see and demanding he be fired from his job.
There's this guy named Caleb who works at West Elm, and there's a whole article written about him now, and if you try to go on his LinkedIn, you can't even find it anymore.
Accusations of love bombing, gaslighting, and other forms of interpersonal abuse were especially common, with folks decrying this guy as essentially an abuser. One person also alleged that he sent them an unsolicited nude over this dating app, an accusation that is very clearly the most serious thing out of anything said here, and also the thing that paradoxically got the least traction.
Long story short, I'm waiting online at a bar and he sends me a full mirror selfie with his face and his everything in it with his out. And I was like, one, that's very risky. Two, what the fuck? And then the next day proceeds to ghost me. And I was like, what the fuck? And then I deleted it. I'm not that type of person to hold on to nudes like that. And then the next month messages me again and goes, sorry, like I was just afraid that you were gonna use me for my body. I was like, huh? I thought we were getting coffee.
With that accusation, of course, came the notion that this man was an abuser and deserved everything coming to him, up to and including doxing. On the whole, this was, for most people, a piece of hot gossip that they could have fun with the justification that this was some kind of activism. As the days stretched on, the frenzy and fun at the demise of West Elm Caleb started to die down and became replaced with a culture of condemning the whole affair. Suddenly, we started to see a lot of think pieces and opinion articles decrying what happened. Comparisons to Justine Sacco were frequently thrown around, there was a lot of condemnation of how out of control things got, and so for a lot of parts of the internet, they reached this conclusion that what happened to West Elm Caleb was in fact bad. But this remained a pretty controversial conclusion. To this day, you can find a lot of pieces of content explicitly calling this an act in service of women's liberation, just as you can find content calling it stalking or a form of public abuse. It's a whole mess. So there's a lot to unpack with everything that happened here, but I think a good place to start is to look at the dominant discourses that emerged when it comes to this dude. The first notion is that what happened was, if not an explicitly feminist act, at least one that could somehow act in service of feminism. This is ostensibly a guy who has harmed women in a very personal way, in a very calculated way, in a way that without the existence of these social media platforms probably never would have been noticed. When it comes to this interpretation, what happened with the West Elm Caleb phenomenon was a form of giving a voice to the voiceless. And I think the main driving force we see behind this interpretation here is one of turning individuals into symbols. So you go on these internet forums that theoretically dedicate themselves to women's liberation, although obviously some of these places are their own cans of worms, and you see this consistent discourse pop up. And you see sentiments like, this is a form of real-time accountability, and women need to work as a collective. That's the only way we can make change in our patriarchal society. And no sir, spare me your protests. We're now all onto your tricks. Game over. We will call you out and publish your rat face all over social media, and if you don't like it, then change your behavior. We are no longer tolerating this shit, and we're collectively waking up. It's a lot of we. We won't tolerate this. We will call you out. We are holding you accountable. And that's interesting, right? West Elm Caleb isn't really just one guy. Instead, he's made into this icon, a sort of representation of every other guy like him. You might not have been able to personally get any kind of remorse out of the asshole who ghosted you after weeks of seeing each other, but you can humiliate this Caleb guy. In this way, the response against Caleb is essentially seen as a broader symbol for women rising up on the whole, for a sort of collective act of feminism, not just toward one single guy for the benefit of a dozen or so women in New York, but toward every asshole guy and for the benefit of all women. It also serves as a theoretical tool of deterrence. Because Caleb is every single guy, those same consequences could theoretically be imposed on every single guy who acted similarly. Which is just... Generally speaking, the ability to call attention to harm done to you as a form of accountability is just that, responding to a way you personally have been harmed. And this Caleb guy hasn't personally harmed most of the people who are treating these actions as a site of personal liberation for them. Sure, you can say we are rising up against the men who harm us, but in this case, the language of personal victimization just doesn't apply to most of these people. But the people discussing these issues are generally referring to women, at least women who date men on these apps, as a collective. West Elm Caleb didn't just harm the women he ghosted, but actually harmed women as a class. Caleb is the Shaka Khan of shitty dating app guys. They're all in him. And as a result, you see not only the usage of the language of broader scale feminism to condemn this guy, but also anyone who condemns the harassment he received. BuzzFeed News writer Katie Natopoulos wrote a piece not even really defending him, just going, whoa, this is probably wildly disproportionate, and just got absolutely torn apart in the comments for it. Like, Katie, honey, if you hate women, just say that. And I hate it when women writers do this. And ew, this feels very misogynistic and women hating. Do better. So we're seeing not only one individual and their individual level actions being taken as a sort of representative microcosm of broader gender relations, but also any statement about the morality of what happened around this guy is also seen as being made in the context of those gender relations. To these people then, Katie Natopoulos wasn't commenting on the treatment of a single person. She was wading into a broader discussion about how men treat women and coming down on the side of men. And I think there is something to be said for this notion. The decisions we make on a day-to-day basis don't exist in a vacuum. Everything we do, who we interact with, what we believe, what we buy, what we say, those things both influence and are influenced by the powerful systems around us. That certainly doesn't mean that every individual interaction we have is explicitly a broader commentary on those social forces, but I don't think it's unreasonable to notice patterns in the way we act in those individual encounters. Who do we choose to defend? When? Why? Who does this happen more often with than others? I think these are questions worth asking. And so I don't want to dismiss out of hand the notion that anything said in these discussions might have broader value in a larger conversation about gender dynamics in dating. But that being said, I think there is always going to be something somewhat concerning about the ways in which individual people and individual instances of interpersonal conflict or harm can be taken and treated as symbols without much regard for the actual individuals involved. Just by the very nature of the act of turning a person into a symbol, you are quite literally dehumanizing them. The act of applying a broader political conflict onto the full life and human totality of an entire person, stripping away everything that doesn't serve that narrative to turn them into a paragon of anything positive or negative, is by nature an erosion of someone's humanity. I think there is still broader value in recognizing patterns in how people are treated in interpersonal relationships, which is, what this video is, but at the end of the day, no. West Elm Caleb or any other private individual who is held up as emblems of particular social problems is not every asshole ex. He's one guy, the guy that he actually is. And thus, any actions taken for or against this guy are not actually actions taken for or against patriarchy, no matter how much we try to abstract that fact. They are ways in which one human being is treated. The reason I'm talking about this at all, of course, is because this issue isn't unique to this one guy. The idea of taking a private individual, often someone who is being publicly shamed, though this can work in the opposite way as well, and essentially stripping away their actual personhood to view them as representatives of broader social ills or virtues is a very common one, and this particular guy is only the newest iteration of it. I mean, when you look at the phenomenon of, say, Twitter main characters, the entire conceit of that is that you get to string up a person who has humiliated themselves for a day and have a delightful and fun time reveling in the collective schadenfreude of it all. Sometimes you have people who attain this kind of popularity specifically because the things they have to say are so wildly out of the ordinary. So that's people like the dad who didn't let his daughter eat until she figured out how to use a can opener, or the guy who tweeted that one weird post about hogs. But oftentimes those main characters go viral because they're viewed as perfect little microcosms for various social concerns. So for instance, you had this guy who made a snarky tweet about people who read books in bars and who later walked it back and apologized in a pretty thoughtful thread. And so this guy faced a huge amount of backlash to the extent that there were actually tabloids like the New York Post writing articles about him. And especially common was the narrative that this guy was some kind of pickup artist or someone who was trying to hit on women and didn't understand them. He was just getting really, really ripped apart for it. And I think this take went viral largely because this guy was kind of seen as the ultimate representation of creepy men who won't take no for an answer. This was people's opportunity not just to dunk on him, but every guy who made that kind of claim. Ironically, he'd later clear up in his apology thread that he made that post to complain about pickup artists as well. But essentially, this notion of treating people like sacrificial representations of shitty beliefs or ideals is nothing new. It's bigger than West Elm Caleb, and that's why I'm talking about this now, even though the cultural shift has largely concluded that what happened to him was bad. Because oftentimes we'll reach that conclusion about shaming mobs after the fact. We'll stop and we'll reflect and we'll go, wow, we probably shouldn't have done that, and then we will take zero lessons from that when it comes to the next time it happens. We see them as individual regrettable mistakes and not patterns we can learn from and avoid next time, so this keeps happening despite these cultural shifts. That's why we need to talk about it as more than just a bunch of isolated incidents. We need to dig deeper into all of this than just going, well, that was a mistake. So let's do that. I think oftentimes when we get to this point, the discussion shifts from being about the inherent morality of specific systems or actions to this idea of deserving. And that's something we see a lot when it comes to the angle of the Caleb stuff as essentially an act of feminism, decrying the actions of the general amorphous mass of TikTok users who engaged in all this stuff was quickly met with backlash because, well, this guy is a bad person. He does bad things. Often terms like gaslighting and love bombing were thrown around, which, put a pin in that one, we'll get back to it. The point is, who cares? Why are we bending backwards to, if not defend, at least have pause for this shitty dude who treated women in an awful way when, historically, that's been the norm? We're often stopping to consider the feelings of shitty dudes who treat women in an awful way, both individually and institutionally. And I do think this isn't a bad point. Someone actually brought this up to me on Twitter when I made a thread essentially being like, hey, why are these random dudes with bad takes going viral when all that does is amplify the harmful voice of someone who would otherwise be a total nobody? They were like, well, why is this who we have to pull out all the stops to care about, especially when this kind of harassment happens to women all the time? Again, on its own, this is a fair point. Women are often put through the ringer of public shaming, and while I haven't seen anything super recent that's on the same level as corporations taking out billboards to publicly shame a private citizen, which is why I'm talking about this case in particular as something special and worth discussing, it happens in smaller ways all the time. One thing I myself will say is that while I have regretted choosing to be snarky or blasé on the internet, I have never regretted choosing to be kind. If I have one regret, it's that when my friend Lindsay was experiencing large-scale harassment, I didn't do an adequate job of standing up for her. I should have, and I didn't. And so while I think this case study is absolutely worth talking about and is certainly unique in a lot of ways, I don't want to dismiss out of hand the notion that this guy is getting hand-wringing think pieces about how he's treated that a lot of more marginalized folks who have faced public shaming didn't get. I think it's our ethical responsibility to hold fast to our principles when this kind of thing happens to anyone, and I think that's something worth noting going forward. And so once again, that brings us to this issue of deserving. The idea then is that this is a culture where we are finally getting accountability for people harmed in these interpersonal situations. And so doesn't this guy kind of deserve it? If we go by the worst things said about this person, this is an abuser we're talking about. Again, more on that later. And honestly, this here is the crux of what I want to talk about, because I think this is really the core of a lot of these kinds of issues online. And what I want to discuss here is not just about this one dude, not at all. I think this is an issue that arises time and time again when it comes to how people are treated online. There are two things I want to talk about here. The first is system building, and the second is proportionality of response. So first things first, I think on the whole, the word accountability can be kind of nebulous when it comes to discussing how to deal with wrongdoing. In some cases, folks use it to mean a redressing of harm. You know, someone who stole returns the stolen thing style stuff, a person who was abusing a position of power has to step down from that position of power, that sort of thing. Where the focus is directly on remedying existing harm and preventing future harm. And in other cases, the way the word accountability is used means it can be just as easily swapped out for the word punishment without any real semantic change in what that person is trying to say. It's just a nicer way of asserting that certain people deserve to be punished. It's not focused on hypothetical victims, but rather on the idea that some similar degree of harm needs to be doled out to the perpetrators of wrongdoing, and that is what will fix the issue. It relies on this notion that everyone who has enacted some kind of harm deserves punishment, and that by enacting that punishment, we are doing the correct thing and fixing the problem in some way. Now, my own personal philosophy is already fairly against this idea of retributive justice on the whole, but even if you are someone to whom this idea rings true, it invites in a lot of ethical questions, ones people have been trying to answer for centuries. But how do we decide this? How do we determine, one, who is actually deserving of punishment in the first place, two, what that punishment ought to be, and three, maybe most importantly for this discussion, when does the punishment stop? How can we all even agree on this? If we believe that the idea of enacting harm on people who deserve punishment is valuable, who is worthy of making that kind of decision? I mean, we're all just a bunch of individuals. I certainly do not consider myself fit to determine who we dole out punishment to and how much. Are you? Are your friends? Your enemies? Probably not, right? In a legal sense, the closest system we really have are the courts, and those are already just intensely fucked up. They're filled with corruption, with laws that were actively designed to be racist and disadvantage certain people, with individuals enacting them who are often either actively malicious, apathetic, or just overworked and drained. And this is the best system we currently have. These processes are theoretically pretty meticulous. When an individual is on trial, they're given the opportunity to speak for themselves and defend themselves, just as those who oppose them are given the opportunity to express why. The ultimate decision on what happens to them is, again, theoretically, made by those who have heard out everything they have to say. And again, this system is intensely fucked and also the best thing we have. Compare that to the kind of decisions on a person made by a collective somewhere like TikTok, with little context and little preparation for the actual gravity of what's happening, on a platform that treats it like entertainment. Why on earth would we expect random individuals in a system that's worse than an already pretty fucked up one, a system where there's no expectation of hearing out a defendant, for instance, to be able to make life-changing judgments on people? Of course we're going to get bad outcomes. And I think this is why it is especially important to consider the kinds of social systems we build. They've failed us before. A lot of people who've been reading up on TikTok and similar platforms lately have probably heard of Couch Guy, but if you haven't, Allow me the misfortune of explaining the situation to you. So, this university student who's in a long-distance relationship with her boyfriend wants to surprise him with a visit, and she records it. It's about 20 seconds long, and it's of this guy sitting on a couch with some friends. She comes in, and they hug. And I guess people decided that his body language was kind of stiff and awkward, which, you know, okay, sure, I guess. And from that, decided to extrapolate entire conspiracy theories. Let me be clear, this was a massive phenomenon. At the time of this writing, that clip has 65 million views, 5.3 million likes, nearly 150,000 comments, and over 400,000 shares. There was an entire genre of video made about how this man was not only almost certainly cheating on her, and that's why he looked slightly awkward in a 19-second clip, but also how, by virtue of him saying, "No, I'm not cheating on you," he was a toxic, manipulative abuser who was actively gaslighting her. And in case you got the idea that this was just a means of online harassment that could be easily turned off or blocked, this man had people find his real-life apartment and do things like film him in public and slip notes under his door. Likely partly as a result of the true crime brain poisoning online, where the private lives of private individuals are fun mysteries to be solved in real time, and partly the frenzy of joyous entertainment, this man was shamed for doing literally nothing wrong but look a bit stiff in a video to the point of harassing him in real life over it.
I've watched this video way too many times, but look at the beginning here. It looks like her hand is on his back. Like, that looks like a thumb and maybe a finger. Like, how sus?
The boyfriend from the couch video has officially responded to everybody calling him out. This is what he had to say, pause to read. As you can probably tell, he is not happy with how everyone is analyzing the situation. I mean, I wouldn't be happy either if over 30 million people saw me cheat like this.
I want to talk about these girls on the couch, because these girls are not your friend. And before you say, "Oh, you don't even know them," I know them. We all know them. It's one of the reasons that your video resonated so much with 34 million people, because we've all had friends like this in our lives.
This guy, one of Couch Guy's friends, asked for our psychology degrees to show our sources and where we're getting our information. And while I have no psychology degree, I do watch a lot of Criminal Minds, and I'm very interested in body language and what that can tell you about a person. So I'm going to go through my perspective based off his body language.
Said Couch Guy wrote a really excellent article about what it felt like to be in the center of it all. I'll link it in the description because I really love it, but I want to highlight two choice quotes from it because they feel relevant to this entire discussion.
This tabloid body language analysis, something typically reserved for Kardashians, the British royal family, and other A-listers, made me, a private citizen who had previously enjoyed his minimal internet presence, an unwilling recipient of the celebrity treatment. And the extent of our collective power is less obvious online, where pylons are delivered, as journalist John Ronson put it, like remotely administered drone strikes. On the receiving end of the barrage, however, as one finds their reputation challenged, body language hyperanalyzed, and privacy invaded, the severity of our collective power is made much too clear.
I think both of these quotes get at the crux of what's happening here really efficiently. Our current systems, ostensibly designed for social media, are not suited to make full-throated judgments of private individuals. They're just not, and how could they possibly be? Beyond the aforementioned lack of necessary context to make decisions about individuals and the totality of who they are, this kind of detached shaming as entertainment also negates a lot of important factors in favor of what essentially boils down to middle school bullying. For example, a person looking stiff and awkward on the internet is already a totally normal and fine way to be, but the invocation of this as a sort of justification for armchair psychoanalyzing an individual is just made even worse by the existence of, say, neurodivergency. When everyone is an expert on what gaslighting looks like or what active deceiving looks like, it's very easy to set aside factors like, hey, maybe the person who isn't making eye contact in a video isn't a cheating, abusing serial killer. Maybe they're just autistic. That's not to say a person has to be neurodivergent for it to be bad that they're unwittingly cast as the subject of public shaming, but more so that the existence of these social factors makes it extra fucking worrying that people who don't fit a very strict mold for what a normative individual looks like are automatically being cast as dangerous and deviant. And that isn't even getting into other factors that, by sole virtue of just deviating from a perceived norm, are treated as cause for condemnation of an individual. Another example that gets gets floated around a lot when it comes to cases like this, and rightfully so, is that of Sabrina Prater. So Sabrina is a trans woman who, while she was not out at the time of all this, had trying to come out in her bio, who posted some videos of herself dancing in an unfinished basement. She was just dancing. Maybe a little weirdly, but who cares? Let her dance. And the internet, because of course it did, decided that she was a serial killer. I wish I had an explanation for y'all. I really do, but I do not. People decided that because they perceived her as male and she was dressed up in women's clothing, and because her backdrop was messy and her dancing was strange, she was not only a serial killer, but a serial killer who was planting secret clues in the background of her videos about her murders. You know, as all competent serial killers do.
So there's something ain't right about this TikToker. This TikToker goes by the name of Sabrina Prater. Everybody's been talking about her, and I just went through her page, and I found some crazy shit, guys. So who are they on those security cameras, and why does she have security cameras in an abandoned house? This is literally the house that she films at. Why does she have, cameras?
Now, let me explicitly state, in case this wasn't fucking obvious, the reason people are willing to perceive trans women who appear impoverished as inherently violent or dangerous people is because of decades upon decades of transphobic bullshit framing them as such. People were straight up directly comparing her to Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and yeah, this is not an organic idea coming straight from people's rational judgment. It is the product of years of bigotry. This is the kind of judgment people en masse who are doing true crime speculation for pure entertainment make. It's not a rational or measured one, it's one informed by everything we absorb with no attempt to measure or filter out the stuff we shouldn't. And this shit absolutely devastated her because of course it did. Why wouldn't it? So why am I bringing up Sabrina Prater and Couch Guy when it comes to Caleb? He, at least as far as we know, isn't a neurodivergent person, nor is Couch Guy that we know of, or trans, or impoverished. Theoretically speaking, it's quite likely that people's judgment of the guy as an asshole fuckboy isn't incorrect. Well, I'm bringing these examples up to really hammer on a very important point. These systems are fucking terrible at making the right calls. They are very bad at determining who deserves to be turned into objects of public shaming. They should not ever be trusted to make the right calls on the totality of a person and how they should be treated. And when we use these systems, we are normalizing them, no matter how we use them and who they are used on. What do I mean by this? Let's say you build something designed to harm the bad people and help the good ones, and that creation relies on human judgment, sure, but you have really good judgment and you care very deeply about others and you don't consider it the worst thing in the world if bad things happen to bad people. You've invented the torment nexus, and you set it loose on all the wrong people. They are tormented. It is entertaining and it is harmless in your mind and you are doing the right thing. And sure, that human judgment fails sometimes, but those are isolated incidents and they are exclusively comments on human judgment, not on the torment nexus itself. So long as the machine is tormenting the right people, those fuck-ups are fixable and you have done a good thing. Except no, you still invented the torment nexus. Every time we engage in the behavior of tearing down a random some guy who we feel has done harm, we are strengthening the apparatus of the public shaming of private individuals, even if we feel we've correctly shamed the right private individual this time around. And when that apparatus is strengthened, it's emboldened to keep functioning. And in the case of public shaming, that functioning relies on the judgment, or lack thereof, of people who are very fucking bad at this. I am including myself in this. It's a bad system, not through the fault of a bunch of individuals, but because the system itself is broken and designed to churn through the lives of individuals like a never-ending meat grinder grinding out hashtag content. Put another pin in that, more on it later. The more these systems are used, the more they're normalized, both on an algorithmic level and on an interpersonal one. Algorithms see the views and the clicks and that we eat this shit up and they hand you more just like it on a silver platter. And individuals are trained to see the interpersonal fuck-ups or even just vaguely distasteful or deviant seeming moments of private individuals as an entertaining content well. Unfortunately, a lot of people's politics, at least implicitly, are designed around the idea of finding the right person to hurt. Hurting certain people is understood to be wrong, but there's still this underlying notion that there exists a right person to hurt, and that by harming that kind of person, we are making the world a better place. And certainly, sometimes some people do need to be hurt in some contexts. Sometimes we need to fight for a just world. But when we feed into these systems, and we do so with the unspoken motivation of, at least to some extent, entertainment, I think there is another part of ourselves we nourish. Truth be told, I do think there exists a part in many of us that we don't want to talk about or acknowledge that is a horrible, gleeful asshole who enjoys watching people fail and get their just desserts. I know that part exists in me. Of course, I take some joy in watching the people I consider bad fail. But we have a choice in whether or not we choose to nurture that person. And on top of normalizing the specific behavior and teaching the actual algorithmic machines to shove someone new into the stocks and parade them around, we're cultivating our own worst impulses. Again, we aren't bad for having them, but we do have a choice when it comes to feeding them. Jeremy Bentham was an English philosopher living in the late 1700s who was especially interested in theories of law and social justice, and he came up with this concept of the Panopticon, essentially a prison structured around a central watchtower that could theoretically observe any of the cells at any time. The actual watchtower is concealed, so as a prisoner, you don't know whether you're actually being watched at any given time, but you do know you always could be. And without really knowing, you're forced to operate under the assumption that you're always being watched. Bentham thought this form of constant presumed surveillance would be cheaper and lower maintenance than existing systems, since it doesn't actually require the manpower to constantly survey everyone, just the uncertainty that you could be monitored at any time. This is an idea that's persisted for centuries and is often used as a metaphorical concept to highlight the way digital surveillance warps our brains. It's been used to talk about phone calls being monitored, or ad companies tracking your search history, or more recently, the expectation that when you are out existing in public, you could always at any time become subject to being filmed and posted to millions of people who have never met you for essentially any perceived monetizable action. I mean, remember when that teenage boy at a Target checkout became a viral hit online for no reason other than that someone photographed him at work and thought he was attractive? A lot of people laughed it off at the time, but this constant expectation of surveillance and monitoring of private individuals existing in private interpersonal contexts is fairly concerning. Sociologist Michel Foucault, king of things are like prisons, wrote fairly extensively about the context of the Panopticon and things like it in our daily systems, essentially describing how we can become so policed that we begin to police ourselves. As he put it,
"He who is subjected to a field of visibility, and who knows it, assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection."
So essentially, to Foucault, it's the mere fact of being constantly observed by those in power that can warp our own behavior and self-perception and can essentially subjugate us. Perpetual monitoring from others begets perpetual monitoring of ourselves. We are made to exist in a context where we are so subject to the gaze of power that we start to implement it in ourselves. We start to see self-surveillance and self-discipline as a norm, and that fucks with us. I think this concept is, again, especially worrying in the context of those earlier examples, where individuals merely existing outside of dominant social structures are punished for it. But I think things like the Caleb stuff set a worrying precedent beyond that as well. Because when low-level harm in interpersonal relationships can become the subject of public pageantry, there is no longer an expectation of privacy for anyone. Like, I really need to stress that whether or not you believe this guy was an asshole for ghosting some dates, this is, at worst, private interpersonal harm. And what we're doing here is setting up and reinforcing the idea that any interpersonal fallouts can be made subject to public judgment at any time. For entertainment, let me be clear. And even if you believe it's justified in this case, it sets a very bad precedent, because abusers know how to utilize and weaponize the language of the abused very, very easily. They do it all the time. I spent a lot of my formative years on Tumblr.com, where teenagers would very frequently make public call-out posts about interpersonal fallouts, demanding that their acquaintances publicly disavow their friends or ex-partners. There is no expectation that interpersonal relationships remain interpersonal, and that is a system that is not only bad for all of us because of the self-policing it creates, but also one that can be very easily weaponized by abusers for their own purposes. And so even if we see what happened to this Caleb guy as funny and okay and justified, and let me be clear, I don't, the social machine that we are constantly refining still learns from it. The things we do still get normalized on a wider scale. And so what happens when these systems, this meat grinder greased with every new individual we shove through it, gets more normalized and more robust? We get more of it. More of a system we know is at best extremely flawed and at worst nothing more than a broken clock. And again, bad actors are very good at gaming these kinds of systems. Abusers adopt the language of the abused. Marginalizers adopt the language of the marginalized. Again, let me draw your attention to the pin we put in calling individuals love bombers and gaslighters and abusers en masse. We're still going to get to that. We've seen what can happen. These systems absolutely devouring the marginalized for just appearing marginalized in a public space. And when we add fuel to the torment nexus, we add fuel to that as well. We need to consider what kind of behavior we model and normalize. We need to consider how the systems we build can be used against us. We need consistent principles. Honestly, I think this is a fairly consistent problem when it comes to people with progressive values and generally good ideals. It's easy to hold fast to your principles when they already align with your general sensibilities. Think about the number of people over the years calling wholeheartedly for the abolition of harmful carceral systems, and then when they're faced with crimes they personally find horrific, they immediately start to backpedal. It's an understandable impulse, but one we need to push back against. Another thing that leads to is preventing us from viewing the contradictions in our own ideology. The irony is not lost on me that a lot of people who consider themselves ostensibly progressive, who are abolitionists, who are theoretically against this idea of punitive justice, are suddenly completely okay with it when it's applied to the context of social media. It's a contradiction in our own principles, and it's one that we don't notice when our principles are not actually consistent. And these principles need to be consistent. If we're only applying them to people of whom we personally approve, they're not principles. We're just cherry picking. But I think we've been thinking in overly binary terms thus far. It only gets treated as a question of judging whether an individual did something wrong or not. It's easy to say, yes, certain people do not deserve to be publicly abused because they did nothing wrong. But even if these are bad systems for doing so, this person is a wrongdoer and thus deserves some kind of retribution. And so I want to bring us to that next point, that point about proportionality of response. Because here's the thing. It does not have to be true that someone did nothing wrong in order for us to oppose all of this, even beyond the point about feeding into these harmful systems. Because I think another thing we need to consider on top of all of this is this question of proportionality. So I've talked about context and judgment and an even greater degree of unmitigated bias as factors that distinguish these online systems of shaming from more formalized ones. But I think another one is that there's this relative lack of restraint, and I think that a lot of it comes from the fact that this behavior essentially just comes from a collection of individuals, ones who mostly don't see themselves as significant actors in any of this on their own. It's hard to talk about the power of a collective because of this, to be honest. Because generally speaking, no specific person here is a powerful entity we can point to and whose behavior we can individually analyze. In the case of the Caleb stuff, even some of the women who made the original videos were horrified with how quickly it spread out of control, how little it actually became about them or their wishes at all. It's just a bunch of individuals, each of whom views themselves as having little to no power in these interactions, acting individually. And on top of making it hard to discuss collective behavior because, no one sees themselves as a significant part of any collective, you're just yourself and you're just one guy, these systems also make it extremely hard to control proportionality. The thing is, I do think this guy did some things wrong. Most of these things were none of the business of anyone commenting on this, but nevertheless, I do think that's the case. But even for the most punishment-oriented of individuals with the most draconian personal philosophies, there's generally some notion that at a certain point, a punishment needs to stop. Again, court systems are very fucked up. They are often wrong, and even they generally have some notion that at a certain point, a person has been punished enough and the punishment ends. Though, obvious disclaimer that I'm speaking as a Canadian here, and this is a whole can of worms and not universally applicable. I'm not defending the courts here. But generally speaking, most forms of social punishment are viewed as having some kind of threshold that's determined by an individual who's theoretically reviewed all of the relevant facts. But a crowd just doesn't have that. There's no point where every single person involved in this stuff is going to collectively stop and decide, hey, this is getting intensely disproportionate to the actual crime in question. Because how could they? This is millions of individual actors who, again, don't see themselves as holding power as individuals. Everybody thinks that they're just doing their own thing and having a laugh that's a drop in a bucket at most. Everybody thinks they're punching up. Everybody thinks they're Dumbo. And what that creates is a system where no one can decide things have gone too far. No one decides when a punishment ends because there's no way everyone is ever going to reach that conclusion at the same time and agree on it. It's effectively considered indefinite. And not only that, but there's also no mechanism for making things right if we do realize that someone has been punished excessively. When the mechanism for punishment is a public shaming, what does a reparation for that look like? There isn't one. The best thing that can happen is just that the crowd gets bored of you and moves on. Something that is inevitable, but also in and of itself incredibly tenuous because it leaves lasting impacts on everyone who goes through this machine, regardless of when the boredom hits in. If the best thing we can say about sending a tornado through someone's house is that it'll dissipate eventually, we don't have much good to say about the situation. And the thing is, because of our tendency to think of these things in just an innocent, guilty binary, this can really easily get obfuscated. It's either this guy did nothing wrong and doesn't deserve to be punished, or this guy did something wrong and therefore deserves punishment. If someone is a wrongdoer, then they deserve punishment. So there's very little room to say, yes, we can acknowledge that someone is a dick. We don't need to challenge the concept that someone did something wrong, but that we can also acknowledge at the end of the day that that doesn't really matter. Relitigating the extent to which a person did harm is not the point, and this is not a question of just did someone act poorly, yes or no. Because even if the answer is yes, what matters is that the actual response that arose from all of this was vastly disproportionate, and it's disproportionate in a way that is inherent to the very nature of this kind of mobbing. You can be an asshole in an interpersonal context and have done shitty things and still not deserve to have your real name and face and personal information put on blast to millions of people by individuals and corporations alike for, let me be clear here, fun. The point in all of this should not be to concern ourselves exclusively with questions of innocence and guilt, because at a certain point, it should not and does not matter. This is an interpersonal issue. Even if we buy that by virtue of ghosting someone and acting scummy about playlists, and the most serious accusation in all of this, and also the one people seem to care about the least, sending someone an unsolicited nude, you are guilty of some form of harm, this is still interpersonal shit we are talking about. If this is, as we consider it, a guilty person, at a certain point, that still stops mattering. The guilt or innocence of a given party should not be the sole focus of any discussion about any of this. At this point, the focus needs to be on whether the response was proportionate to the supposed harm done. And No, absolutely not. None of this is proportionate. And we don't need to see this individual as a person who has done nothing wrong in order to acknowledge that. It is so besides the point. This is the case with all of this and all of these individuals when we exclusively concern ourselves with did a person do wrong rather than is the punishment enacted upon this person reasonable or proportionate. It's very, very easy to simply turn a blind eye to the harm done to certain individuals because we consider them guilty of some form of wrongdoing. That is bad. Writer Rainfisher Kwan wrote a really excellent piece on this whole debacle on Substack, and I'm going to link it in the description, but I also want to highlight this particular part. Fisher Kwan writes, "This is what discomforts me the most, the commodification of feminist rhetoric by young aesthetic progressives who seek only to silence criticism and justify self-interested consumption that, even if it did manage to yield some anti-abuse result, was clearly never about it in the first place." She describes the process as trying to seek and destroy the lives of real people for a perceived moral fault that's more posthumous justification than actual instigator is the choose-your-own-adventure for the 21st century. She identifies something really important here, that the justification of somehow avenging harm done to others is transparently untrue. The point is not actually about reducing harm, it's about the entertainment and, in some cases, catharsis that comes from all of this. Any supposed harm done by West Elm Caleb is only used as a cudgel against anyone who acknowledges the wildly disproportionate nature of hundreds of thousands of strangers engaging in coordinated doxing and public shaming of a private individual for private interpersonal shit. Because at a certain point, the binary of guilty-innocent no longer matters. And to a lot of people, I don't think it ever did. This is the part where we need to take out that pin that I've been driving into the board, that one about love bombing and gaslighting and whatnot, because I think that on its own reflects a very concerning trend I've seen just absolutely blow up in the past few years, and that's the trend of using deeply serious and pathologizing language to describe individuals where it very likely does not actually apply. The term gaslighting has been so memeified and used so much that it essentially just becomes treated as a synonym for just lying or, in extreme cases, simply disagreeing with someone. Love bombing, a term that refers to overwhelming someone with excessive praise and admiration for the implicit purpose of drawing them in to abuse and exert control over them, is used in the case of this Caleb stuff to just mean attracting hookups. Toxic has become nothing more than a filler word to describe anyone we dislike, as has narcissist. We've essentially created entire categories of people who we brand as fundamentally broken and evil on the sole basis of our own conflicts with them, and couched it in nice, progressive-sounding therapy language. This is very bad. And I can understand where this arises from. The first is the fact that social media is designed to engender the most polarizing versions of various takes. A post from someone accusing their ex-friend of gaslighting is going to get more reach than a post from someone accusing their ex-friend of just being a mean asshole. It's the kind of language we're algorithmically set up to see, and the kind of language we're therefore incentivized to use. The problem is systemic. We repeat the language we're trained to see, and this is especially true of young people for whom regular interpersonal conflict is their first exposure to a term like love bombing. That's how they're going to understand and use that terminology. I think that's why it's especially important to push back on it. When we use armchair psychological lingo against anyone we feel has wronged us, it's very easy to cast others as agents that can only do others harm because of a way in which they are incorrectly wired. If the people who harm us are fundamentally narcissists, we can never be them. And that is not only a very dangerous way to view others, it's directly antithetical to self-reflection and changing your mind about people as you grow, but it's also a very dangerous way to view ourselves. Ultimately, though, this entire analysis has been missing a fairly large chunk of something, and you might have already noticed its absence. I hope thus far that I've made a case for why, beyond this one dude and the various discourses and takes and attempts to relitigate the morality of this guy's actions, although that's remotely the fucking point, all of this matters. Because at the end of the day, the West Elm Caleb stuff is over. It's old hat. But as long as the machine keeps grinding, it's going to keep happening. It might not look exactly like it just did, but it's going to be the same machine greased with the same stuff. And if I'm going to encourage people to reframe how we see the systems that we engage with, we need to talk about a larger actor that plays into all of this. And in order to do that, we need to ask ourselves a very important question. Who is benefiting from all of this? It's not women. As much as I understand the benefit of the collective catharsis of getting to publicly dunk on a representative of every guy who's ever ghosted you online, and as much as I do think there is something to be said in general for social media being able to give a voice to the voiceless, it's just not. Insofar as we can claim any class of people is materially benefiting from something, there needs to be some sort of gain outside just a temporary feeling of catharsis and amusement. And realistically speaking, that is the only arguably liberatory thing to be gained here for women as a group. That it feels good for just a second to see consequences imposed for a behavior you feel has hurt you and gone unpunished in the past. But a quick dopamine hit doesn't actually translate to liberatory praxis. Again, you could potentially argue that it creates a culture of surveillance where men are more hesitant to ghost women for fear that they could be publicly shamed for it, and that this is feminist in some fucked up way, but strengthening the Panopticon strengthens that whole machine. There's just as much of a chance that next time we could see men doing this to women on a similar scale, or, I don't know, internet detectives doing it to a trans woman for dancing while visibly trans. So I don't think it's that either. Is it the people making the original TikToks? I guess to some extent, the whole situation likely translated to a follower boost for anyone who got to bask in the limelight of West Elm Caleb for a second. But I don't think it's that either. Like I said before, the whole movement, or whatever you want to call it, got out of their control very quickly, which is why you had people involved in the original calling out, saying this whole thing had gone too far and calling for moderation. Starting a campaign of public shaming isn't synonymous with leading one and may not even be a deliberate choice. So maybe there's a small sliver of clout to be gained here, but I don't really think it's this either. No, the real answer is corporations. When a person goes viral on TikTok, when a hashtag about them gains millions of views and hundreds of thousands of users making their own original content about this person, the primary actor benefiting is TikTok, because outrage equals engagement, and engagement equals profit. And not only are they the ones directly benefiting and financially profiting from this, their algorithm actually actively incentivizes it. Do you remember how I said that all the women who went on dates with this guy somehow ended up finding the original TikTok about it and all just coincidentally happened to see and comment on it? That's actually not true. It wasn't a coincidence. I lied to you. I've gaslit you. I've gaslit you all. That happened because TikTok is designed to show you content from people you already know. What happened was that the algorithm recognized that all of those women had a common contact on their phones, in this case Caleb, and so started showing everyone each other's videos. So not only was everything that happened essentially in service of boosting engagement and profit for this massive social media platform, but the fact that it even happened at all directly resulted from this corporation deciding that better engagement happens when you connect people with mutual friends. It's an algorithmic feature that has led to things like, in some cases, people being outed as queer to their families before they were ready to share because the app recognized that they were contacts in each other's phones. And in this case, it was a decision that enabled and actually encouraged the publicization of private interpersonal conflict for peak online engagement. I cannot stress this enough. This is all happening for corporate profit. The only entities materially benefiting from any of this are corporations. Also, in case I haven't made it explicitly clear, the fact that feminism has been used as a cudgel in service of corporate profit here doesn't mean that feminism is therefore no longer valuable. There's this tendency to decry certain forms of social consciousness because corporations are trying to exploit them for money, claiming, for example, that anyone who supports wokeness is a sucker because corporations can use it for advertising purposes. So I want to specify that the issue here is not that these platforms are too woke. The issue comes with the structural incentives that fuel these platforms. They will use anything they can to justify this. In the words of one of my friends, feminism being used as a fig leaf for the brutal public vivisection of some fuckboy isn't actually an argument against feminism precisely because it isn't actually about feminism. I wanted to explicitly state that here because the fact that women aren't collectively benefiting from any of this is not evidence of feminism itself or wokeness itself being inherently harmful. It's evidence that corporations will exploit and mine any ideology they can for retroactive justifications for the abuse their platforms beget. It's not just TikTok either. In the wake of this whole West Elm Caleb stuff, you had multiple corporations trying to capitalize off of this mass shaming. Among them were the aforementioned upcoming dating app Keepler, an app that had previously used other viral instances as marketing opportunities and took out that fucking billboard shaming this guy, a rug company, Peacock TV, a birth control brand, and fucking Hellmann's mayonnaise. To say nothing of the various tabloid websites just having an absolute blast calling this guy out with the same conspiratorial tone you'd use to describe a celebrity breakup, presumably to a high volume of clicks and comments. These are companies that witnessed the horrors of this shit and only saw dollar signs. And that's not meant to be an indictment of the individual social media teams that posted this stuff, some of whom have since deleted it. It's what corporations fundamentally are, how they're designed to function. The ends are growth and profit. The means are whatever achieves that. Look at this cynical shit. Look at this brand just joyously posting about how the whole stunt encouraged people to download their app. Even the brands who decided to delete their posts didn't do so out of some desire to be socially conscious. No, it was because they did the risk-benefit analysis and decided that it did more harm than good for their public image and thus future profits. I found this article on a newsletter site designed to be read by brands and marketing execs, essentially analyzing whether it was a good idea to post a West Elm Caleb tweet or not, and it's a very interesting read. Interesting derogatory. That's largely because at no point in the article is there an assessment of the human cost of any of this. It's all about approval ratings and numbers. Again, this is just by the very nature of how corporations function. This was a profit-generating opportunity for them. And that is what happens when we feed a machine that sustains itself on outrage and constant engagement. We do not benefit as individuals or as a marginalized group of people. The object of our shame neither grows nor benefits. We don't get beneficial cultural shifts that make the world a better place to live in. We get number going up for corporations. This is all happening for corporate profit. So what can we do? How can we make sure this doesn't happen in the future, that we aren't adding more bricks to the foundation of this Panopticon which we've all made our home? Well, a few things. As I said, I don't think individuals are necessarily the primary actor driving all of this, not when the algorithms we use encourage and feed off of it. This is largely a problem of systems, and we need to hold these corporations just as, if not more, responsible than we hold ourselves. The power for specific individuals to enact harm ultimately comes largely from the systems that give them that power, and from the algorithms that shove the most polarized and dangerous versions of every belief and argument directly in our faces to stuff their own wallets and encourage us to do the same. I think as time has passed on the Caleb stuff, more people have started to realize how fucked up it all was, and the tide has shifted there. But analysis of corporations and systems have kind of taken a back seat to just focusing on individuals and what individual actions we should all be taking. I don't think we should lose focus of the actor with the most power and the most material benefit in this situation. But at the same time, I still believe individuals, when part of a greater collective, have a lot more power than we might perceive ourselves as having. While which videos were shown and what cultural memes start to take force may not necessarily be our fault, I would distinguish that claim from the idea that we have no collective responsibility. I think we have a responsibility here to exercise a lot more judgment and restraint when it comes to these incidences of public doxing and surveillance than we might have been exercising in the past. That means a few things. It means avoiding this pathologizing language that overstates harm as much as possible, because we know that kind of language feeds into this. On the whole, we need to stop accusing people of gaslighting and other forms of emotional abuse because they're assholes. As much as I understand where that impulse comes from, I honestly think we need a return to clearer terminology here. Sometimes someone isn't an abuser. Sometimes someone is just an asshole. It's okay to use the word asshole in these cases. That's a good first step. It's also important to hold true to and maintain consistent principles. If we believe a specific act, like let's say retributive justice or letting a bunch of corporations join in on a public dogpile of someone, is always morally wrong, we need to hold fast to that even when we don't like the individual in question, even when that person truly is an asshole. Otherwise, when we're readily willing to abandon those principles based on matters of personal judgments, the systems we create are going to be much more exploitable and much more vulnerable to bad actors using them to enact harm. I think we also need to check our own entertainment impulses on occasion. I know imploring people to think about the person behind the screen is an axiom we've been trotting out for years now to little success. Because it's much easier said than done, especially when, again, someone seems like they're actually an asshole. But what might help us here is reframing the discussion from being about the person on the other side of it to instead being about us and our morals and how we choose to exercise them. Because ultimately, the way we treat these individuals across social media really isn't about them, it's about us. We have to be better than that, even if they never will be. If not for the future victims of these systems who might be in a far worse situation, or for avoiding putting more money into the pockets of corporations that see human suffering as a profit vector, then for ourselves. We deserve that. Honestly, one thing I've really been working on as of late is trying to disengage a little bit from some of the online spaces that I think nurture the worst impulses in myself. It is often so easy to send a snarky tweet out in the void, to talk in a way I do not talk like in real life, and only really regret it later when the dopamine hit of online interaction wears off. This isn't good, but I also know I'm not alone in it. So one thing I've basically been working on doing ever since about last August when a bunch of stuff happened is trying to do more creative work that isn't filtered through a screen. So I started taking pottery last summer, which is so fun. That's actually where the mug I've been using in this video came from. I made it. And if you follow me on social media, you'll also know that I've been picking up knitting for the last couple of months. I've been taking classes at a local yarn shop, but I've also wanted to just kind of level up and get better and more practice with skilled individuals, which is why I'm super thankful to have found Skillshare and super grateful to them for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is essentially an online learning community with thousands of online classes that cover tons of different subjects. There's just a huge breadth of skills you can learn, from still life photography to gorgeous watercolor painting to meditative writing to YouTube thumbnail design to cooking to playing the guitar, and basically anything else you can possibly imagine. So for me, I've been taking this Melissa Warren class on knitting basics, and it's been so fun and such a nice way to just engage with the physical, tactile world. Also, I've been working on a hat, which you can actually see here, and getting to develop those skills is so cool, and I get a great hat out of it. If you're interested in trying out any of these classes and either developing new skills or refining existing ones, Skillshare is a really great place for that. It's ad-free, so you can develop your skills without the distraction of ads. There are new premium classes launched every single week, and if English isn't your first language or you want to get some more practice with another one, you can get Skillshare's entire catalog with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German. If you're interested in joining Skillshare, just click the link in my description. The first 1,000 people who click that link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. On top of a big thank you to all my patrons, I'd like to specially thank Kitsune for joining my $20 plus tier. Welcome.